Oh, hi! You caught me organizing garbage. Speaking of garbage, let's take a look at the worst X-Men run of all time.
Comic tropes. Comic tropes.
Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris, and welcome back to X Month. I know, that's really impressive, isn't it? Just so cool. Listen, in the previous two episodes, we've looked at what I consider some of the best and most underrated runs in X-Men. This week, we're doing the opposite. We're going to look at what I consider the all-time worst X-Men run. It involves the story of a creator who got his start illustrating Miracle Man with Alan Moore. Then he transitioned into illustrating porn comics and then somehow ended up writing mainstream comics for Marvel. This is the story of Chuck Austen. Chuck Austen broke into the industry illustrating 3 issues of Miracle Man in 1986 with Alan Moore, and he did that under his birth name, Chuck Beckham. From there, he changed his last name to Austen because his father had left his family when he was young and he had no desire to keep the family name. It was as good a launching platform as anyone could ask for. From there, he transitioned into doing the porn comics strips and hardball. He immediately followed that by illustrating the Little Mermaid comic for Disney. At this point, you may need medical attention because this career path can give you whiplash. We're talking working with one of the premier writers in comics to working on porn comics to drawing a Disney comic and then suddenly working at Marvel Comics, one of the mainstream superhero publishers. It's crazy, this career path. Chuck Austen broke in the late 90s writing books like U.S. War Machines, which was a black and white, mature only weekly comic book, and in a short amount of time, he was given the keys to one of Marvel's crown jewels, Uncanny X-Men. To put this all into context, the most popular X-Men book at the time was New X-Men by Grant Morrison, and there was also Extreme X-Men by Chris Claremont, who had recently returned to writing the characters he worked on for 16 years. That meant that a lot of the major X-Men characters weren't available to Chuck Austen. He was left with the following team from prior writer Joe Casey. Archangel as team leader, Nightcrawler, Iceman, and Wolverine as the seasoned team members, and newer additions Chamber from Generation X and mutant prostitute Stacy X. Honestly, that ain't a great team. You got characters like Chamber. Chuck Austen wasn't interested in him, and he gets the heave-ho almost right away. Stacy X, I don't think any writer ever gave her an interesting, believable personality. She's pretty much entirely defined by having been a prostitute. Wolverine, now obviously he's super popular. He's pretty much on every team by default. But he's not used a lot, so either Chuck Austen wasn't interested in using Wolverine, or maybe Editorial just didn't allow Austen to do any big moves with the character. So you're left with a lot of mid-tier characters that just were never that interesting. Austen may have seemed like an odd choice to have been plucked out of relative obscurity and given the reins to an X-Men title, but it's worth putting this into context. At the time, Joe Quesada was the new editor-in-chief, and he was picking some unique choices across Marvel as writers. He gave British writers Grant Morrison and Peter Milligan some X-Men books, and picked then indie crime writer Brian Michael Bendis to work on stuff like Daredevil and Ultimate Spider-Man. And most of that paid off in a big way. Austen gave an interview at the time to Comic Book Resources, where he said it was important to him to give his readers what they wanted. I'll give Chuck Austen some credit. I think he was trying to deliver what he thought readers wanted. And in the past, some of the stuff that worked well in X-Men were examining themes like Professor X uniting humans and mutants. There was stuff like characters having secret pasts that got revealed in complex mythologies. And then, of course, there was lots of soap opera drama between character relationships or teaching the new generation of students. Those were all important elements to X-Men, and I think that that's what Chuck Austen was trying to deliver, but I think he failed in that delivery. So let's go through chronologically some of his X-Men run. I'm not going to recap the whole thing, but I'm going to hit some of the I was going to say high points, but maybe low points, because this is what ultimately led to Chuck Austen being pretty much the least popular X-Men writer of all time. The first 3 issues of Austen's run is an arc called Hope, which is all about introducing 2 cast members to the title. The first is Nurse Annie, a woman who is caring for former X-Man Havoc, who was living in an amnesiac and catatonic state. He had previously been thought to die in an explosion in X-Factor number 149. For some reason, Annie has fallen in love with Havoc and is awkwardly discovered by Havoc's brother Cyclops walking in on her talking about how she's in love with him. Cyclops shuts her down by saying Havoc was already in a relationship, then picks him up instead of using his wheelchair, and Annie then volunteers to move into the X-Mansion to take care of Havoc, to which Cyclops apparently just agrees. Annie is a single mom and a nurse, and there are flashes of her having an interesting character, but this is wasted potential. Like most of Chuck Austen's female characters, her primary motivation is being in a relationship. It's strange, but it's all his female characters talk about, and we'll get to some worse examples soon with the character Husk, previously a member of Generation X. At another point in this story, Stacy X decides she's into Archangel and kisses him, and that goes nowhere. The other new character to the team is Juggernaut, a villain who dates back to the days of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Juggernaut is an odd choice to put on the X-Men team, mainly because he's been a villain for so long. Now, the X-Men do have a history of trying to rehabilitate a lot of their enemies. Characters like Rogue, Magneto, Mystique, Sabretooth. At one time, they've all been enemies of the X-Men that have also been brought in and made members of the team. So that is a part of who the X-Men are. I don't think that they would be against trying to rehabilitate Juggernaut. However, Juggernaut is infamous. He's known all over the world because he's gone up against the X-Men, he's gone up against Thor, he's gone up against Spider-Man in very public battles where he destroys, half a city. He's incredibly powerful and he leaves a lot of destruction, so he's got a lot of crimes to answer for. He can't just hide. He's just too big and famous. It's a weird choice. To Austen's credit, he does use Juggernaut's past as an excuse for how he would be integrated into the X-Men. Juggernaut has had a long friendship with another villain, Black Tom Cassidy. At this point in time, Grant Morrison had invented the idea of mutants sometimes having a second mutation. And in this story, Black Tom's has activated and is turning him into a giant plant man. Juggernaut calls the X-Men for help. However, Professor X does a terrible job relaying that info, just telling the team to fly to an island to investigate something, and giving them no info that it was his evil stepbrother that called them. Because Professor X is busy helping a picked-on mutant who looks like a fish. And Professor X recruiting this at-risk teen totally makes sense. It's in character for Professor X. A lot of times in the past, X-Men have vacillated between roles as proactive superheroes, as defenders of humanity against evil mutants, or as teachers for a new generation of mutants. But that said, you'd think that Professor X could take all of 5 seconds to telepathically tell his team, "Oh, expect to encounter the Juggernaut. He's actually the one that called us." Instead, the team begins fighting with Juggernaut, but is interrupted when they get captured by Black Tom. However, Stacy X uses her hooker powers to seduce Tom and release the team. Archangel goes from the blue he's been since Apocalypse experimented on him back to a healthy shade of pink. Iceman gets stabbed by Black Tom, and for the rest of this run, slowly turns into ice. Juggernaut is knocked into the ocean and is ready to just die, but Professor X flies in, and Sammy, the kid that he was helping, uses his Aquaman powers to swim down and convince Juggernaut not to give up. I'll give Austen some credit. I think that this is one emotional moment that actually works. This kid decides that he's actually useful in this situation. He helps convince Juggernaut not to give up, and they actually form a friendship. And I think it might actually be the basis for Deadpool 2's use of Juggernaut, where he forms a friendship with Fire Fist. It's strange to think that that's where it may have come from, but I really think it may be. Anyway, that's sort of the high point right off the bat, and everything is downhill from here. The next 4 issues seem like filler. There's no supervillains or enemies to battle. Professor X recruits Northstar, a mutant who previously had been a member of Canada's super team Alpha Flight. Northstar has a massive ego like characters Thor or Namor, but that gets left to the side when Austen writes for him. Instead, it's constantly mentioned that he's gay. That's his only defining characteristic. He reluctantly agrees to try teaching at Professor X's school and meets up with the X-Men, who are in the process of helping a young mutant boy whose powers have manifested. He explodes from time to time. Northstar argues that it isn't safe for him to be in the X-Jet or be carried by Archangel, so he will step up and fly the kid to a facility that can help him, because he's the only one that could handle the potential explosion. The kid is freaked out to learn that Northstar is gay, but gets over it. Then he explodes and seriously injures Northstar while dying. So much for Northstar being able to take an explosion after all. Meanwhile, Nurse Annie moves into the mansion and is greeted by Husk. She instantly reveals that she does not like mutants, and almost every time we see Annie, we now get a caption that says, "She doesn't like mutants. She has her reasons." Husk is a former member of Generation X who is now smitten with Archangel. Stacy X notices this, calls her out in front of everyone, then storms off saying she's going to go watch some porn and basically never factors into the X-Men ever again. Presumably she's still watching porn somewhere, maybe some of Chuck Austen's. Anyway, the problem with this run is primarily that its characters are all very one note. They're not well rounded. Juggernaut likes Sammy. Northstar is gay. Annie is in love with Havoc. There's just not much to any of these characters, and there's no overarching plot. Nobody progresses through a change. There's nothing big. It's just a series of events, things that just happen. The next several issues continue an idea Austen has for Archangel. He didn't just turn pink when he healed from Black Tom Cassidy's attack. His blood can now cure wounds, which is kind of gross. On top of the idea that Archangel has to smear blood on people to heal them, we're casually told by Husk that mutants can't get AIDS. That later gets reiterated by Archangel to a doctor in another story. There are no characters with AIDS in any of these stories. That's just an idea that Chuck Austen took out of left field and just threw out there. It has nothing to do with anything, and it's never mentioned again. Archangel bleeds on characters like Northstar and Husk to heal them after battles. A lot of stories in this book take place in the X-Men's hospital now that Nurse Annie is a recurring character. Husk falls for Archangel, and Archangel seems interested, but at one point, Cyclops warns Archangel that it's a bad idea, joking, 16'll get you 20, and pretending to be in handcuffs. Because Husk is a teenager from the Generation X team, and Archangel is one of the original X-Men and is much, much older. The relationships in this book are all awkward. Havoc wakes up from his coma, for instance, and thanks Annie for taking care of him while he was in a coma. She stumbles over her words when she tries to say giving him sponge baths was just part of her job, saying, "Well, yeah, I could have been the naked one. I would have been, not the naked one, that's not what I meant. I meant the one without clothes on, and you'd be naked. The one with clothes on, and you'd be rubbing me naked. Cleaning, not rubbing, cleaning, sponging, in a medical way." There's also a page when Havoc wakes up from his coma where the X-Men tell him all the things he missed while he was in the coma, including the 9/11 terrorist attack, Colossus dying, and the mutant nation of Genosha being destroyed by Sentinels, which killed 16 million mutants. It's hilarious because it's so much depressing news dumped on him at once. The next arc is called Holy War, and Marvel priced the issue at just 25 cents in an attempt to lure in new readers who had recently seen the second X-Men movie. The book is nothing like the movies, though. This arc is all about undoing Chris Claremont's story where Nightcrawler had become a priest in the Catholic Church. The X-Men wake up one day to see Jubilee and several other mutants crucified on their lawn. Nightcrawler is horrified, but also thinks to himself about his codename and how, in his past, he's had lovers call him Blueberry Muffin. Not an ideal time to think about your sexy nicknames while your teammates and friends are bleeding and dying in front of you, Nightcrawler, but that's Chuck Austen's sense of humor for you. It's always poorly timed. Archangel bleeds all over the wounded friends to heal them, but only Jubilee and Magma survive. Skin and Bedlam, among others, are killed off. The X-Men determine this is the work of the Church of Humanity and begin to track them down by going to the church in Montana where Nightcrawler had been ordained. Jean Grey looks at some blood on the ground and declares it's mutant blood. Jean Grey should probably just quit the superhero biz and join a CSI team if she can identify blood just by looking at it. The X-Men eventually determined that the church wasn't really part of the Catholic Church, and someone had been brainwashing Nightcrawler to think he had been going to a real church. We're shown the leader of the evil sect who crushes the heads of some lieutenants with bare hands. The church's plan was to get Nightcrawler placed as the next pope. That's easy enough, right? Then they would have his image inducer fail, leading to the world seeing their new pope turn into the demonic-looking Nightcrawler, which would somehow turn the world against mutants. Like, turn them against mutants more than they already are, I guess? This would also somehow destroy the Catholic Church and then the Western world, which is part of their plan, and I guess we're just going to forget that this is the Marvel Universe where people know about mutants and aliens and other weirdos. Ultimately, the leader of the church is revealed to be an ordinary woman with no superpowers. Not sure how she crushed those skulls earlier. Also, a big part of her plan was to kill off churchgoers with communion wafers that make people explode, which she thinks will make people assume the rapture is taking place. It makes no sense, and it gets worse. The next story was all about revealing the real father of Nightcrawler. Supposedly, Chris Claremont's original plan was to reveal that Mystique and her lover Destiny were Nightcrawler's biological parents, and the shape-shifting Mystique would have been his father. But Editorial didn't want to imply that Mystique was anything other than a woman, so it was implied that she was the mother and his biological father was a mystery. Chuck Austen's next issue, number 428, is a flashback to Nightcrawler's birth, which is said to be 20 years ago. Now, I don't want to bore all of you with a long, deep continuity lesson, but Nightcrawler was born more than 20 years ago. This just doesn't make sense. In his introduction to X-Men, that took place back in Giant Size X-Men number 1, and we were told that the youngest member of the new team was Colossus at age 18. Shortly after this, we're introduced to Kitty Pryde as a team member. She was told to be 13. And more recently in the comics, it was definitely established that she was 18 years old. So that's a 5-year span. That's locked in. There's nothing you can do to get around that. Even if we throw out the Kitty Pryde thing, we have to assume, say this took place 20 years ago, well, that would mean that all of the X-Men stories since Nightcrawler was introduced took place in 2 years or less. That doesn't make sense. That's just not paying attention. That's lazy writing. We learn that Nightcrawler's father is a teleporter who looks like a red demon, and he's named Azazel. And over the course of the story, we learn that he is trapped in a hell dimension and is supposedly the basis for humanity's idea of the devil. That ignores that Mephisto actually is the devil in the world of Marvel Comics, but don't pause to get too hung up on that, because I'm not pausing to get hung up on the fact that Archangel's blood doesn't heal Nightcrawler, instead it burns him like holy water on a vampire. Moving on. Azazel has apparently been giving birth to teleporters so that they can ultimately unite and open a gateway that allows him to get out of hell and come to Earth. Do you see the problem here? Azazel goes to Earth to give birth to teleporters that will help him get to Earth. This just doesn't make any sense. And look, maybe I'm not reading between the lines of his plan very well. Maybe he wants to, teleport an army from hell to Earth, something like that. It's not written very clearly. All you really get out of this story is there's this new idea that angels and demons, as we see them, have really always existed as large groups of mutants. There have been mutants with wings that have healing blood, and there have been demonic mutants that can teleport back and forth to hell. it really ruins Nightcrawler when you think about it, because the idea of Nightcrawler is so important to X-Men. He was chased by villagers who thought that he was a demon, but really, he was a human that just looked different. In fact, his personality is charming and friendly. This just sort of throws that all out the window by saying, no, he really was essentially a demon. It really undermines and undercuts what X-Men is. And I'm skipping past some very weird elements in this book, like Iceman turning into ice, then being broken and being just a head, who reconstitutes his body by sucking all the moisture out of one of Azazel's lieutenants, killing her, and then joking about it. Or She-Hulk defending Juggernaut's crimes to the Canadian government and then sleeping with him. Or the reveal that Zorn, who Grant Morrison created as a fake identity that Magneto used to infiltrate the X-Men, was still a real person. Except Magneto didn't steal his identity. Instead, Zorn has a twin brother, and the real Zorn was pretending to be Magneto, pretending to be Zorn. So Magneto wasn't killed in Grant Morrison's run, Zorn was. And now his twin brother is the new Zorn. These stories will make your head spin. There's a story where the X-Men go to visit Husk's family, who are involved in a feud down in Kentucky. On one side is Husk's family, the Guthries, and their enemies, the Cabots. There's a teenager, Josh Guthrie, who is in love with Julia Cabot. And the story is supposed to be like Romeo and Juliet. But in Romeo and Juliet, both of their families were jerks, and it made their love impossible. In this story, the Guthries are all good people, so there's no real tension. The Guthries would gladly accept Julia into their family. Also, sometimes dialogue in the story is straight out of the Shakespeare play, but the characters in X-Men aren't quoting it, they're just talking like that, which makes no sense. And then, Archangel declares his love to the underage Husk, and they fly up in the sky and start having sex in front of Husk's mother and the X-Men team. Chuck's X-Men run continued for a few more issues, but the damage was done. As soon as he finished his X-Men run, he went over to DC Comics, and he was given a contract to write 12 issues of Action Comics. But apparently he got so much hate mail for what he'd done in his Nightcrawler story that DC just decided to end it early, and they had the final 2 issues written by a ghostwriter. He's not credited. He was basically drummed out of the business. Chuck Austen did a few more independent comics after this, but he's never come close to working on mainstream comics since. It's kind of sad, but it's such bad X-Men storytelling that I would really recommend not only not reading this stuff, but if you ever hear about it, just ignore that it happened. Just pretend that stuff did not take place, because it adds nothing to the X-Men mythology. There's no overarching plot that changes anything. There's no iconic villains that show up. And really, there's no character growth for anybody, with the arguable exception of Juggernaut, but nobody else ever followed up on any of that. So it's really just ignored. She-Hulk writer Dan Slott later found a way to retcon that She-Hulk had slept with Juggernaut. And I don't blame him. That just doesn't make any sense. So it's not great. If I'm going to give the run some credit, I will say that it did have a lot of talented artists. You've got Ron Wagner, you've got Kia Asayama, you've got Sean Phillips. They're all really good. But then there's also some arcs that have art that I hate. Philip Tan has some artwork that is just not my cup of tea. And you know what? It might not all be Chuck Austen's fault. Let's break this down and look at it. And Editorial should have definitely been there to rein in his worst impulses. And they definitely should have watched continuity a little bit more closely. It's just a really sad story all around. It is bizarre. Any one of these issues would make great material for just breaking it down and poking fun at it, just making jokes, because it is some weird storytelling. All right, that's all I've got to say about this run. Before we go, let's take a quick look at what fan art came in this week. We have 3 pieces, starting with a return from Ian Satakis. Very nicely done, Ian. Thank you so much. Vidas Sekunis from Lithuania provides this next piece. I hope I got your name right, Vidas, and it's really lovely artwork. Thank you so much. And finally, Yasir bin Kaiser presents this piece based on my recent Lady Cop episode, and he asks for helpful critiques. Folks, if you have artwork directly related to this show, please feel free to send it to this address, comictropes@gmail.com, and I'll feature it. I will also draw a winner each week to win a Gachapon prize out of the Gachaponi machine. This was donated to us by Lunar Shine Store, and I picked these Gachapons up in Japan. So we've got 3 entrants this week. I'll just drop these into a bag, we'll shake it up, and see who wins the Gachapon this week. It is number 1, Ian Satakis. Ian, let's see what you got here. All right, pulling it out. I'm looking at it, trying to. It's something to do with Transformers. I can't really make it out too well. Probably y'all can't either, but there's some sort of a Transformers robot in there. Ian, I'll get your contact information, send that your way. I hope you enjoyed this look at a run that wasn't great. You know, I love looking at good stuff, but good stuff can't be good stuff unless we look at the opposite end of the spectrum for comparison. So, you know, hopefully it was still fun and we learned something from it. Not trying to trash people, just saying, hey, sometimes things don't work out. Next up, we will conclude X Month. It's not directly related to X-Men, except it definitely fits within X Month. That's all I can say. I know that's mysterious, but until I see you next week, I hope you will keep reading comics.